Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Reardon. I am the Horticulture Small Farms Extension Agent for Johnson County. And today we are going to be talking about all about tomatoes in our Dig Your Dinner session for April. I'm joined by Chelsea, and she will be talking about all of the nutrition and the cooking aspects as well as preserving. But first, we're going to dive into the growing aspects of tomatoes here. So, tomatoes are actually your most popular crop that is grown in any kind of vegetable garden. They are very, very widely grown, and there's many facets to keep in mind as you are growing them. Specifically, there are a lot of issues that can pop up as you're growing them. So, we're going to kind of talk about those issues as we learn about growing them here today in my portion of the presentation. So, as always, I like to give a plug for a few different publications that can help you out throughout these programs. The first being the Kansas Garden Guide is always going to be a great go-to with all of your most pertinent tomato information. So, if you have the Kansas Garden Guide, pages 186 through 188 are where the tomato pages are. And also, there's a wealth of other just vegetable gardening information in there as well. You can buy a physical version at our office, at the extension office, or you can also find the free version at this link that is published here. We also have a publication that's specifically dedicated to tomatoes, and that is the MF 312 tomatoes. And if you just go to the KSRE bookstore and look that up, you'll be able to find it. So, overview of tomatoes. The first thing I wanted to point out with tomatoes is that moisture is key. And this goes beyond just saying that your tomatoes need to be watered. A lot of the issues that actually develop with your fruit are directly related to either the inconsistent moisture in the soil or too much moisture on the leaves or fluctuating just moisture in the soil in general. So really having consistent moisture within the soil is going to be your best friend when growing tomatoes. Also, your soil nutrients are going to be very essential when it comes to preventing a lot of the issues that you see with tomatoes. So we'll talk about that. And then variety and maintenance are also going to play a large role. There's, as I mentioned, many, many varieties of tomatoes and different types of tomatoes as far as the way they grow and the form they grow in. So we'll discuss that. And yes, as I mentioned this last bullet point, many conditions for troubleshooting. So we'll go through them all. So when you're planting your tomatoes, if you are one of the people that likes to start their tomatoes indoors, you want to start sowing those 4 to 8 weeks before planting. Ideally, tomatoes will be planted outdoors in early May. So if you are aiming for that early May window, you've kind of missed your window already for sowing those seeds indoors. But they can actually be planted as late as June. So if you were to theoretically sow them indoors literally right now, you could get those starts into the ground by June and still have a good tomato crop. Another thing to keep in mind is that these are going to be large plants and they're going to be high maintenance plants. So those two factors mean that you are going to need a lot of space for your plants. They actually need to be planted at least 2 feet apart, depending on their growth habits. And then also the rows themselves should be 3 to 5 feet apart because you're really going to have to get into there for the pruning, for the tying, for the general maintenance, and then obviously the harvest. When you have a giant shrub, you really need to be able to really reach into that plant. So having an ample space to work is going to be essential. And then also, when you are considering where to put your plants, crop rotation is always going to be something you want to keep in mind for mitigating pest issues. Anything in the solanaceous family is what you're going to want to avoid. So if something is including tomatoes, eggplant, potatoes, peppers, or tomatillos have been planted in a spot last year, you will not want to plant your tomatoes in that spot this year because a lot of those same pests can persist in that area. As with all of our vegetables, light is going to be essential, but because this is a fruiting vegetable specifically, it's very much going to be essential for the success of your tomatoes. So full sun, at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight a day. And also that heat will be, to a point, helping those fruits develop as well. So the sun is really going to be essential in success. Again, moisture and consistency, as I was beginning to harp on, is really going to be your best friend here. And that's because there are so many different issues that pop up with inconsistent soil moisture. So to keep that consistent soil moisture, obviously you can stay on top of your watering and try to really monitor it, but also mulching your garden beds with straw is going to be your best friend, especially around your tomatoes because it will help keep that moisture in place for longer, and it'll just be a little bit less maintenance intensive to keep that consistent moisture. An ideal pH for your tomatoes is going to be 6.2 to 6.8, so right in that slightly acidic range. This is going to be really important actually because of blossom end rot, which I discuss on this next slide. So anytime you are seeing blossom end rot in your tomatoes, it is specifically being caused by a calcium deficiency. But that doesn't mean to just take calcium and add it to your soil, because your pH could be playing a large factor in the availability of that calcium. You could actually have a lot of calcium physically present, but it's not able to be absorbed because your pH is too high. So to get your pH back down to that 6.2, 6.8 range that we see here, you would just have to add sulfur to try to amend your soil a bit, and will then unlock the calcium that's in the ground and make it more available to your plants. And then the other issue that causes this is that the inconsistent soil moisture directly contributes to when you are seeing this. Chelsea, are you able to look at the audio issues? Let me know if you guys can't hear me, please let me know and we'll try to figure that out. Then another thing that you want to keep in mind with the inconsistent soil moisture is it directly attributes to growth cracks, a very another common issue that you're seeing with your tomatoes and fruiting. Essentially, what this just is on the fruit is it's a stretch mark. It's caused by rapid intake of water at once. So when that happens, it's going to rupture the skin on your fruits. It's not going to be very sightly, and then it also opens up the fruit for secondary pathogens to enter. So you're either going to open that up for fungi or for insects to get into there and then further destroy the fruits. So best way to do this to avoid this is inconsistent, or it's to avoid inconsistent soil moisture and have that mulch down so that you have that moisture there. The other things you keep in mind is that this is often associated with the tomato variety that you're growing as well. Some will be more resistant to cracking, so watch the varieties that you are putting into your garden. Another issue many people will mention when they're growing tomatoes is that their tomatoes just aren't producing, and that is often attributed to having way too much nitrogen in your soil. So I wanted to mention this while we're discussing soil. Is that if you are fertilizing, you're adding way too much nitrogen, it is going to instigate lots and lots of leafy growth, and you're going to get a huge plant, but it's going to put all this energy towards that huge plant, and it's not going to be putting it towards the flowers or towards fruit production. So nitrogen really kind of needs to be kept in the moderate area, and the only real time to side dress with nitrogen should be when you are seeing flowers or right after you have harvested the first ripe fruits. All the other times, you kind of just want to let the plant be. And then many people also grow their tomatoes in pots. It's one of the most commonly grown vegetables in pots. Again, moisture is even more key in these because it's raised and it's out of the ground, and that soil is directly exposed to moving air, right? So it's going to dry out much more quickly, and you're much more likely to experience those types of issues associated with inconsistent soil moisture. Um, that said, a determinate variety is best, which means it grows in a shrub form, and we'll talk about that in a slide to come here. But that essentially means you're going to keep that compact size on the plant itself, and in a 5-gallon pot, minimum is going to be necessary because, again, big plant, big root system, so those roots need somewhere to grow. Also remember that the location you are keeping your potted tomatoes needs to be somewhere where it's not going to get heated immensely. Often you'll see, your potted plants on either concrete or a patio or somewhere where just the general microclimate is going to be very warm. But you have to remember that 85-degree temperature or above is when your tomatoes will just stop producing in general, because they've shifted their focus to surviving and not to developing fruit. So if you have a microclimate or a patio that just gets really hot in the summer, it might not actually be the best place to be keeping your tomatoes. You want to put it somewhere where it's a little bit relatively cooler, but still getting fuller sun. And then one other note with your potted tomatoes is that you're not going to get the extra large tomato fruit that you would get growing in the garden. It's just not quite possible with the limited rooting space and the limited water and nutrient uptake that you would get in a potted situation. So really aiming for that mid-sized to small fruit is better for potted tomatoes. And so, with that, I wanted to discuss choosing your tomato varieties. There are dozens and dozens of characteristic options that you can be looking at as far as the types of tomatoes that you're trying to grow. There's size and color and taste. Those would be the more obvious ones. But then there's also the forms and what they'll be used for. So there's Roma and there's cherry and there are slicer tomatoes. And then there's also heirloom tomatoes. So there's many options there. And then when looking at how they interact with the environment, that would be the other, bulk characteristic option to consider is, that some are more crack resistant, some are more heat resistant, some are, better to adapted to XYZ. So just keeping those in mind as well. That there's many traits to consider as you are choosing your tomatoes. The general best traits to look for Kansas specifically, though, are your crack resistant and your early maturing, because we do get kind of rapidly transition into that summer heat. So as soon as you can get those fruits maturing before that heat sets, would be better. So that means that tomatoes that develop 75 days or less. And again, just trying to avoid that 85 degrees is ideal. They will begin producing again once the heat goes down, but they will pause at that 85 degrees. Um, and then strong disease resistance will also always be beneficial. So I mentioned that there are determinate and indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. And determinates are more compact, they're smaller. Those are the best for your potted plants just for that reason. They get to about 3 feet tall. Typically, they'll be labeled either compact or bush type. And the biggest difference between these, aside from size, is that with your determinants, you're going to have a window of fruit production. It's kind of all going to set at once. So if you're looking for like a canning situation where you need just a ton of tomatoes right at one time, determinate tomatoes would be a great option because when you're looking at your indeterminate tomatoes, the production is more spread out. It's going to be throughout the entire growing season than a certain window. Also, with your indeterminate, they're going to get to be about 5 feet tall. And because they are so tall and leggy, you're going to require some caging or trellising or staking. And I did want to mention just a few varieties. As I mentioned, there are dozens and dozens of them, but these would be considered some of the old reliable varieties for Kansas. So Slicer, you'll be looking at your Celebrity and Jetstar and Beef. Those are all very, very popular. Roma is Roma. The heirloom varieties that are known to do very well here in Kansas are the Cherokee Purple, Black Grim, Mortgage Lifter, and then Cherry, the Mountain Belle variety is very popular. But if you would like a full list of recommended varieties for Kansas, that MF312 Tomatoes publication actually has a much more in-depth listing of different varieties you could consider. So I wanted to talk about caging versus staking. As I mentioned, it's more common in your indeterminate varieties, but even on your determinates, you're going to want some form of a cage, most likely for just support of the plants, because the fruit does weigh a lot, and it's going to get the plant itself is going to get kind of whipped around in wind if it does not have that additional support. So caging is going to be minimal effort. There is going to be less room for maintenance and harvesting, though. So you have to keep that in mind, as it's going to be a little bit more difficult to harvest and get to the fruits. And if you have to do something like prune, side shoots or something along those lines, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Now, with your staking, it's going to be more labor intensive because you have to train the plants to grow along the stake, and you also have to tie the plant to the stake, which can be quite tedious, but it's going to be more aesthetically pleasing. It's going to be less bulky, so if you have less space to work with, that'd be a good option. And then again, if you're trying to aim for that indeterminate variety that's going to produce the entire season, it would be a good option. So as far as pruning tomatoes go, I mentioned that they get side shoots. The thing that you want to keep in mind is that every time you're pruning something, you are redirecting the energy of the plant elsewhere. So you are taking the energy that was growing into direct, or to growing that side shoot, and now it's going to push that energy towards developing fruit. So that is why pruning tomatoes is recommended, aside from just getting bulk out of there. It will also help with ventilating the leaves itself. There are a lot of fungal diseases that can form on leaves. So if you have more air moving through there, it's less likely those fungal diseases will set on your plants. And then just keep in mind that you don't want to overdo it because the leaves do perform a purpose still. They are producing food for the plant itself through photosynthesis, and they're also producing shade, which is necessary for the fruits. Otherwise, you could be looking at sunscald. So, sunscald on a tomato is essentially just a sunburn on the tomato itself. Usually, it's because it does not have enough leaves on the plant to shade the fruit. And this can be caused by many different, attributes, but essentially it means that the plant itself is not in the most healthy state. So that means you need to be doing a little bit of investigative work, figuring out what's going on with the plant to get it back into a healthy state so that it can produce that shade to protect the fruit. And then I did want to touch on ripening tomatoes as well. So you've gotten to your harvest portion, and the ideal stage for any kind of harvest of a tomato is going to be when it's red, but you don't necessarily have to let that happen when it's on the plant. There is something known as the mature green stage of tomatoes, and it is obviously when it's green, but when it has a white star on the bottom of the fruit, as demonstrated on this photo on the right, that is your kind of indication that it is mature enough to then turn red and fully ripen for you. So a lot of gardeners, if they're trying to avoid certain weather conditions, maybe they know a hailstorm's about to come, or maybe it's fall time and they know a freeze is on the horizon. This is when they'll come through and they'll look at their tomatoes and they'll say, does it have the white star on the bottom? Is it a mature green stage tomato? And those ones they will pull and they will allow to ripen indoors. They will also do this just to avoid any kind of like pest issues that may arise. They'll prefer it to ripen indoors. As long as it's in that stage, it will still do so. And then many gardeners will also say that their fruit is just slow to ripen in general. And what really is going on here is the plant itself is trying to adapt to environmental conditions. So it's usually caused by rapid weather changes. Say it's going from hot to cold really quickly. The plant's just focused on surviving. Maybe it started to put the fruit on when it was, good conditions outside, and then it had to shift its energy elsewhere to keep living. So it will eventually, if the weather, mellows out a bit, it will put its energy back towards ripening. But sometimes you will see those pauses in ripening happening. Some other concerns to keep in mind. There's lots and lots of pest and disease issues you'll see with tomatoes. Hornworm and tomato fruitworm are very common, as you see in the top left here. Bacillus thuringiensis is a natural remedy to this, is a bacteria that you spray onto the plants and they ingest it and it kills the worms. Also, there's spinosad, which is another natural remedy that can help you eradicate these. As far as spider mites go, they kind of look like a modeling of the leaf. You'll see kind of a random browning that moves from the bottom upward. Um, and an example of that is on the top right. The best way to actually treat spider mites is with a strong jet of water. And it's not to spray them off of the plants, but it's actually they are so small and so delicate that a strong jet of water will squish them. So just spraying the leaves of the plants probably once every few days while you are seeing your spider mite issues should take care of it. And then fungi and blights. There are many, many types of types of these that you will see on plants, but specifically your tomatoes. Fungicides are going to be your best bet with those if you are wanting to go that route. Otherwise, you'll probably just have to eradicate the plant and start over in a different area. Viruses and bacteria specifically, these are the ones where eradication and sterilization is absolutely necessary because there is no option for a treatment. So you want to get that plant completely out of the garden and then make sure you're getting any of the leaves and the debris also out of the garden. And you could even consider soil sterilization if it's a severe enough infestation. Then I did just want to mention on tomato hornworm, often with these, you will see them covered in these little egg sacs. This is an example of your parasitic wasps. They lay eggs inside of these worms and they kills the worms. So the wasp itself is considered a beneficial insect that is helping your garden. Now, if you were to pick off this worm and get rid of it and take it away from the garden, all of those eggs have also been taken away from the garden. So you've just removed 200 beneficial insects from your garden. So sometimes the better option may be to put this in an area where you don't mind them munching a bit so that those eggs can hatch and it can die naturally. And you then just have a lot more pest control in your garden. Also, hand picking with these worms is an effective control because they tend to be very obvious, very large, and you can find them and get rid of them without an insecticide. If you are seeing tomato leaf curl, a very, very common condition with your tomatoes, it just means it's stressed out in some form. It actually does not hurt the production of the plant whatsoever, but it could be caused by your weather and temperature, your pruning, fast growth, or too much or too little water. So you just want to do a little investigation to see what's stressing out the plant to try to amend that before it becomes an issue. And then wildlife damage will also be a thing as well because tomatoes are popular with people, but also with a lot of wildlife. So if you're seeing wounds like this on your fruit, probably means something's been munching on it. Blood meal is the best recommendation for this. It is, this plant skid here is an example, but it's not necessarily a recommendation because we don't give those. But anything that has blood meal in it is a good repellent of your wildlife because it's essentially going to trick them into thinking that a predator is nearby. The biggest thing to keep in mind with this, though, is that anytime there's a watering event or anytime it rains, it needs to be reapplied because it's going to wash away. And something fun I wanted to end on here before I hand it over to Chelsea is that tomatoes are technically fruits, which I know a lot of people know, but I wanted to delve into a little bit of the history of that. So, in 1893, the United States Supreme Court actually designated them as a vegetable, and that is because of taxing purposes. So, basically, they were looking at the culinary use over the botanical classification, and that is why it's technically, by law, considered a vegetable, even though it's a fruit. So, with that, I will open it up for questions and I'll stop my share here.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. And as Anthony said, my name is Chelsea. I am the Nutrition, Food Safety, and Health Agent. I'm going to talk about kind of the nutrition, the culinary purposes of tomatoes, as well as what to do with the tomatoes, and specifically on food preservation, because as we know, we tend to have a abundance of tomatoes in your garden or just in the farmer's market. And so what can you do with those tomatoes? So as kind of the segue, Anthony did talk about, yes, that botanically speaking, tomatoes are a fruit. However, nutritionally and culinary speaking, they are classified as a vegetable. One of the things that young kids often learn about first is that tomatoes are a fruit. And so whenever I go into classes, they think I'm lying and they think they got me and that I'm wrong. But I always ask them, do you put tomatoes on your yogurt? Do you put tomatoes on your oatmeal? Do you put tomatoes in your smoothies? And a lot of them will say no. And that's because, again, we don't eat tomatoes like fruit. They're not sweet, they're very acidic. And so we don't eat them the same way. And therefore, they unfortunately make the fruit category sad and are with the vegetable category. So we eat a lot of tomatoes. Tomatoes are the second most consumed vegetable in the US, following potatoes. So that's probably not surprising that potatoes and tomatoes are up there as our leading consumed vegetables, just based on how we consume them. In 2023, we consumed around 19 pounds per person of tomatoes. And not surprising, most of our consumption does come from our sauces and our ketchup. So our tomato sauces, our ketchup, and then of course we have obviously salsa. And so there's lots of different uses, which we'll talk about, of how tomatoes can be cooked in the culinary sense. But do know that usually the sauces and the ketchup are kind of where most of our consumption of tomatoes comes from. So why should we eat tomatoes? Like all fruits and vegetables, they really are a nutrition powerhouse. So 1 cup of chopped tomatoes is about 32 calories. Fairly low carbohydrates at only 7 grams. So if you are diabetic or you're watching carbohydrate consumption, this is a non-starchy vegetable. Therefore, it will be a great addition to your vegetable repertoire so that you're not raising your glucose and that you're not having a higher starchy carbohydrate intake. They're a low protein vegetable, as most vegetables are, with only about 1.5 grams of protein, 2 grams of fibers. They do have a decent amount of fiber for 1 cup. And then, of course, most fruits and vegetables are going to have sugar. They are natural sugars. And again, when we think about fruits, our fruits typically have a lot more sugar and are higher than our vegetables. So this is kind of another example of how a tomato fits better in the vegetable category of how we eat it than our fruits. And 95% of a tomato is water. So it's a very liquid-based vegetable. And we'll talk about freezing tomatoes. If you've ever frozen tomatoes, you know that a lot of that extra water and liquid comes out during that thawing process. Some nutrients that are high in tomatoes is vitamin C, potassium, vitamin K, folate, and then some antioxidants. And all of these RDAs are based on the consumption recommended for women. So vitamin C, you can see it's a great addition. And then potassium and vitamin K are also really important. There was actually just a study they were talking about on the news that if you have heart disease or high blood pressure, that you are required and kind of told to lower your sodium. But on the flip side, we actually want to increase our potassium. So it's important to lower how much sodium we're consuming, but increasing our potassium because potassium is really good for heart function as well as this kind of fluid balance within the body. So that's an important nutrient that we want to consume more of when we're thinking about heart health and reducing high blood pressure. And I'll go a little bit more into antioxidants in the next couple slides here. But so there's a lot of varieties, as Anthony talked about, and their culinary uses do vary. So we have kind of some of those slicing varieties, which we think about are the more larger varieties. And these are great for juicing, crushed, or whole tomato products. They tend to have more liquid than our paste varieties, which is the next one. And these are going to be best for making our sauce, ketchup, and purees. And so our paste varieties, because they have less liquid and less water, tend to make a thicker sauce, then hence why it's great for like ketchup and pureed tomatoes and things like that and paste. And then we have our yellow varieties. These are just lower in acid. They do have a little bit more sugar because they're that sweeter tasting, but they do serve still the same purpose as our red tomatoes, and you can use them. Generally, I would say our yellow varieties are more of those smaller cherry style or those smaller kind of bite-sized ones. Cherry tomatoes are great for salads and snacking, but another great addition when we think about like kebabs and as we get into grilling season is they're a great skewer size. So they fit perfectly on skewers and versus a traditional kind of slicing tomato that you'd have to cut, that obviously would not hold up to a skewer. So they're a great addition for your barbecue. And then there are the green tomatoes as well. Anthony talked about the green ones that you can pick to then further ripen. There are some varieties that are just green to begin with. And so when we think about green, they tend to be a little bit firmer because they're not as ripe. Therefore, they don't have that same kind of texture. They are tangy and slightly sour. And when we think about green tomatoes, we typically think about fried tomatoes. However, they do make great relishes and pickling and can be, again, the same purpose as some of our other tomatoes. It's just the texture and taste is slightly different than our traditional red tomatoes that we think of. And so the primary kind of nutrition component that I want to talk about for tomatoes that is lycopene. And so lycopene is an antioxidant. It is the most abundant carotenoid in tomatoes. And when we think about carotenoids, typically we think about our vitamin A and our carrots. However, it is slightly different than the vitamin A that we find in carrots, but it is still the most abundant carotenoid in our tomatoes. The highest concentration is in the skin. However, throughout the whole flesh, there is still an abundance of lycopene. It is what gives the fruits and vegetables their bright red color. So all of our fruits and vegetables that are red are going to have a high abundance of lycopene. It is a powerful antioxidant. And when we think about antioxidants, if you've listened to any of our previous Dig Your Dinners, we know that antioxidants are kind of those components that scavenge toxins or free radicals in the body that we want to get rid of. So they serve a great purpose to help keep our cells nice and healthy. Lycopene has been researched in various health conditions. So there's been a lot of research on looking at heart health and reducing cancer, particularly prostate cancer. Lycopene has been shown to have a strong kind of positive correlation with the decrease of a risk or prevention of prostate cancer among men. So again, understanding that lycopene is super powerful in a lot of different ways because it is a carotenoid, and it's just also kind of if we think about our vitamin A, it's a fat soluble vitamin. And so it is going to be best if you consume it with a fat. So think about adding, olive oil to your salad with your tomatoes, or adding some olive oil to your pasta as you're cooking it. So that is going to help the lycopene be absorbed a little bit better. There's been several other conditions that research has been done looking at the effects of lycopene. Of course, when we do talk about research, some of that is looking at strictly a supplement form of lycopene. But we know that a diet that is full of a variety of fruits and vegetables work best in kind of prevention of some of these chronic diseases. However, lycopene has been shown to kind of reduce or alleviate metabolic diseases. And then we have other conditions that affect the bone, eye, kidneys, liver, lungs, heart, and the nervous system. And then last, it has been shown to reduce inflammation, obesity, and help with blood sugar regulation. And you might have heard that tomatoes are what we know as a nightshade. They kind of belong in that nightshade family. And some research and some individuals have associated nightshades with a cause of inflammation, especially if you have autoimmune disorders. However, in this situation, it can be a double where we have lycopene has been shown to reduce inflammation, but we know that nightshades increase or can increase inflammation. So just understanding that if you have been told by your healthcare providers to avoid some of those nightshade plants, that tomatoes are nightshades, but for the general population, they do have a positive anti-inflammatory effect on our health and keep us healthy and prevent some of these chronic diseases. I do want to briefly touch on the impact of cooking. So there's a lot of information here on the chart, but basically it's looking at some of the common nutrients. So we have vitamin C, the lycopene, some other of our carotenes, folate, vitamin A, vitamin E, and potassium. As you might see, you will see a decrease in some of the nutrients as you prepare it in some form. So for example, our vitamin C decreases just slightly depending on the form that it's prepared. Same with folate, it might decrease just slightly. But the one that increases and increases quite significantly is lycopene. And so when tomatoes are cooked, the lycopene actually increases. And so when we think about if you are trying to eat more antioxidant rich foods, or you're trying to just have a better diet full of lycopene, consuming it in a cooked form like a sauce or a puree is going to provide a lot higher of a content than, say, a raw red one. And as you can see, they're green because, again, that green color, it's not red. Lycopene is in that red color. So our green tomatoes are not going to have lycopene like our red tomatoes. And so to go a little bit more in depth on that impact of cooking with lycopene, when lycopene is heated and processed into certain tomato products, it is better absorbed compared to that from our fresh, unprocessed tomato. And how this happens is basically the heating process breaks down that food matrix, and all plants have this food matrix that they have. And so it breaks that down. And because of that breaking down of the cellular structures, it results in about a 2.5 times better absorption from your gastrointestinal tract of that lycopene. So again, heating it breaks down that food matrix, making it more available for your body to absorb. So both raw or cooked are great sources of lycopene and great sources of nutrition and vitamins, but just know that heating it, we always talk about sometimes we have a loss of nutrients when we cook it, especially when we think about our heat soluble or water soluble vitamins and minerals. However, in this case, lycopene is actually increased when we heat. So again, just kind of understanding that no matter the cooking method, you're always going to have some losses and some gains of certain nutrients. And it really kind of depends on your ultimate goal and what you're trying to, whether it's a health goal or you're trying to prevent a certain chronic disease, or maybe you're a man and you're trying to prevent prostate cancer, especially if it runs in your family, you might be eating more of those cooked tomatoes versus raw tomatoes. So now talking about preserving tomatoes. Tomatoes are probably one of the most common foods that are preserved by home food preservation. And the key here with food preservation is for our tomatoes is you can either use a water bath or a pressure canning method. Most fruits or vegetables have one or the other, but tomatoes are kind of one of those that can go either way. Personally, most people will use the water bath method for tomatoes just because it's easier. People feel more comfortable with water bath than pressure canning. And the time, pressure canning sometimes can be a little bit more tedious and time consuming to set up and to implement the pressure canning process. We do not want to can tomatoes from dead or frost-killed vines. So again, as Anthony said, if a frost is coming, you want to kind of harvest your tomatoes at that green stage with that little star and then let them ripen. And then once they're ripened, go ahead and use them. But you don't want to use them if they do have some kind of dead or frost-killed vines. Green tomatoes can be canned. They are more acidic than our ripened fruit. So they still can be canned safely using a water bath or pressure canning method, following any of the standard methods and instructions for our red tomatoes. A couple things with tomatoes is we do need to add an acid to our tomatoes. And if you have grandparents or great grandparents that ever made tomatoes or canned salsa, anything like that, you might have noticed or they may have not put an acid with their tomatoes. And this is because over time, tomatoes are actually less acidic than they were several decades ago. Again, this is partially because of our taste buds. If we eat raw tomatoes, we don't like acidic foods. So our taste buds, we tend to go toward those tomatoes that are not as acidic when we're eating them in salads or sauces. And so just over time, those varieties have become less acidic and also soil and a variety of things. So with that being said, we do need to make sure that we are adding an acid to make sure that they can be safely canned using the water bath method to all of our tomato products, whether it's sauce, salsa, paste, ketchup, all of those do require an acid. So here's kind of the example. We have 2 tablespoons of a bottled lemon juice or half teaspoon of citric acid per quart of tomatoes. And then if you're doing pints, it is half of that. So 1 tablespoon or a quarter teaspoon of citric acid. You can use vinegar. However, vinegar often results in a more undesirable flavor because you do have to use more of it. So you use about 4 tablespoons per quart and then 2 tablespoons per pint. So most people tend to lean more toward that lemon juice because you really don't notice the acid and that lemon flavor. It is really just to provide a little more acidity. However, the vinegar often does result in an undesirable flavor. If you are canning, you do need to remove the seeds and skins. They do just tend to not make the product as good and can also give like a bitter taste. If they've been canned, the seeds and the skins often will make the product get bitter over time. So you do want to remove seeds and skins. Now, the last thing for talking about the canning methods is the headspace does vary depending on the product that you are canning. So it is important to look at your recipe that you're using and to double check what that headspace should be. For example, a thin sauce can be about 1/4 of an inch, where if we have whole tomatoes or crushed tomatoes or the juice, it's about 1/2 inch. And then if you're using sauce with a meat, you're going to do 1 inch of headspace. So it does vary. I'm not going to go into the specifics of exactly how to preserve, but we will be having a hands-on food preservation class in July if you're interested. And I also have some other previous recordings that really goes through the steps of how to pressure or water bath can. So if you've never done it before, but are thinking about doing it with your tomatoes this year, we do have lots of resources to help you navigate that process. So there's lots of different ways you can can your tomato products. Tomato juice, crushed tomatoes, a standard sauce. You can even can tomatoes whole or as half tomatoes, spaghetti sauce with or without meat, ketchup, paste, hot sauce, taco sauce, barbecue sauce, salsa. Like the list is endless, which I think it's a great introduction to canning. If you've never canned anything before, a salsa or even just a standard sauce is very easy and kind of can help you build your skills and confidence. We can also preserve tomatoes by dehydration. The thick-walled paste type tomatoes work well just because, again, they have less liquid, so they're going to dry up and hold up better. So the good choices are like our Roma or our Italian type plum tomatoes. And then we want to make sure that we are washing and drying them You can dry with or you can dehydrate with or without the skins. So you can peel them, or as you can see in this picture, the skins are just left on. You can slice them into wedges, and then you're going to arrange them in a single layer on a dehydrator for about 8 to 10 hours at 140 degrees. You can do this in the oven. However, the temperature often is higher and therefore a higher chance for burning it. If you do it in the oven, you just want to make sure that you have a fan circulating and you do kind of have that door open a little bit to make sure that our temperature is closer to that 140 degrees. Most standard ovens only go down to about 170 to 175. How do you know when your tomatoes are done? They should easily bend in half and not break or stretch or stick when folded. And then when you use these dehydrated tomatoes, sometimes when you cook or when you're using dehydrated foods, fruits or vegetables or meats in products, you have to rehydrate them. But in this case, it's not necessary. Some people have never thought about preserving tomatoes via dehydration, but dried tomatoes can be added directly to sauces, soups. They can be added to pizzas, or really any of your favorite recipes for an additional tomato flavor without also having that liquid to add to it. One thing with this is some people will actually preserve strictly the skin. So if you are making a sauce and you peel your skins, then you have all these leftover skins and you wonder what to do with them. And you could certainly feed them to the chickens or you can put them in the compost. But some people will actually dehydrate the skins and then turn it into a powder and then use that powder to add to soups or flavorings for other dishes. So with the skins, because they are thin, you will certainly have to watch them and make sure that they don't burn. But that's another good option, especially when we think about kind of a zero waste mentality with using all components of our fruits and vegetables. And then the last method for preserving tomatoes is freezing. A key thing with the frozen tomatoes, though, is because they have such a high water content, when you thaw them, they will have a very mushy texture. So they're not going to be suitable for a kind of a dish that you're thinking of having that standard tomato in. They do work great for soup, stews, and sauces. You have a couple different ways you can freeze your tomatoes. Option one is where you can wash and kind of dip those tomatoes in boiling water and remove the skins, core, and peel them. And then you can freeze them either in whole pieces or in cut up pieces. The second option is you basically can wash dry, cut out that stem, and then you're going to place them on a cookie sheet and like flash freeze them and transfer them to a freezer bag. So you can leave the skins on. Then when you're ready to use the tomatoes, you're going to peel them and kind of take out any of those seeds and use them as you would. Personally, when you have a bumper crop, and as Anthony talked about, you have sometimes, depending on the variety, a tomato that might do all your tomatoes at once, or you might have a tomato plant that is going to give you a few tomatoes every couple days. And so it's not enough to actually can something. So this is a great method to keep all your tomatoes and then you kind of have them in your freezer. And then when you have enough to do canning to make your sauce or your salsa, you can just take them out and use them. I also like this method if you like a very thick sauce because generally when you're using fresh tomatoes, you do have to cook that sauce down quite some time to get it to the consistency you want to have that evaporated liquid kind of removed. But with the frozen ones, when you thaw them, a lot of that liquid is already kind of coming out. And so it's very thick sauce to begin with, and it's a less kind of cooking time to get it to that texture that you want. Now, using frozen tomatoes for salsa won't work great unless you want a very thin salsa. So if you are planning to do salsa, it is best to kind of have those fresh tomatoes. However, a sauce, it works great for frozen tomatoes or a thin salsa. We do have a food preservation resource for you through K-State Extension, Preserve It Fresh. And so you can find it at our bookstore. Just by a quick Google search, it is also on our extension page, and it is MF1185. So that is available, and it kind of goes into detail all the steps that I've just talked about for the different methods, and then has some more recipes and things. And so to wrap up, as I always do, we have some new or maybe interesting recipes for you to try. So here's kind of a peach tomato and a peach and tomato salad with some goat cheese. And so as we get into peach season and peaches and your tomatoes kind of are going to be coming in around the same time. And so we have some of those ripe peaches with our tomatoes on a bed of arugula or any kind of salad of your choice. And then some red onions, toasted walnuts, and goat cheese. Goat cheese is a very nice soft cheese, but you could certainly substitute any cheese that you would like. And the bacon can be added or omitted depending on your preference and your dietary restrictions. So then the dressing is really just a very simple brown rice, excuse me, spicy brown mustard and a rice vinegar oil. And then we have some just pepper and salt to taste. Whenever you make your own homemade salad dressing, you're going to use a ratio of about 3 cups or 3 parts oil to 1 part vinegar, or about a 2 part oil to 2 part vinegar if you like kind of more of a half and half or a 2 to 1. It really kind of varies on your taste preference. But anytime you're making a homemade salad dressing, you can always add a little bit of a sweetener, whether it's honey, agave, maple syrup, and that just cuts the acidity level depending on especially what type of acid you are using, whether it's a vinegar, a lemon juice, a balsamic vinegar, a white wine vinegar. So it kind of depends on your taste preference. You can certainly adjust the ingredients and components in a dressing as you prefer. And then this was a class that we had probably a year or two ago now, tomato soup, but it's actually a sheet pan tomato soup. So you basically just put all of your cherry tomatoes, you'll wash them and kind of clean them and put them on a cookie sheet. And you're going to have your onions and garlic, and you're going to toss them with some oil and then some salt and pepper. And then they're going to be roasted in the oven. And so you're going to roast them, and it's going to kind of bring out a nice caramelization as well as soften them. And then you're going to transfer them to a blender carefully and add just a little bit of balsamic vinegar. And then you're going to blend it until smooth. The key here, though, when you are using a blender with hot foods, especially hot liquids, you want to make sure that it is vented. So you can either keep the lid off and put a towel on top to prevent any splashes or spillage. Or if you have a top that has like a pour spout, you can just lift up the lid over the pour spout, but keep the whole top on. That just helps that heat escape. Otherwise, that heat and pressure builds up and it can kind of cause the lid to pop off, and then obviously could cause burns. So do be careful when you're pureeing hot liquids. The other thing you could do is use an immersion blender, which basically you just put all the ingredients in a big bowl and then use an immersion blender to blend them up. We have a cherry tomato and basil focaccia bread. Focaccia bread is super easy to make. If you've never kind of dabbled in the world of bread, I would say that this is an easy kind of one to start with. So all the ingredients are listed there. And as always, we will send this recording out. So if you're not able to kind of capture the information now, you can get the recipe when the recording comes out a little bit later. But it's just kind of a nice addition. This would make for a great Sunday brunch, or, as holidays, as Easter is coming up, if you celebrate and you want to have something different, this would be a nice addition to add. Of course, the tomatoes aren't going to be from your garden at this time of year, but it is a great addition kind of for any time, as tomatoes are readily available in grocery stores, no matter the time of year. And then one on the canning piece of it. So traditionally, we would never have thought of making your own taco sauce. Like if you've ever had tacos, you might buy the pre-made taco sauce from the grocery store, but making your own taco sauce is super easy, and you can adjust certainly your taste preferences. So this uses jalapenos and long green chilies. If you don't like spicy, definitely take out the seeds and that clear, or not clear, but that white membrane, and that will help reduce some of that spice. And then basically you're going to combine all your ingredients that are listed here and cook them until it's thickened. And then you will just can them, and you can use a water bath canning method for about 15 minutes. If you're above 1,000 feet, you'll kind of add a little bit of time. Most locations in Johnson County are at or just slightly below 1,000 feet, but there are a couple that are like at 1,005 or 1,010 feet. So try some taco sauce if you have never made a taco sauce before, as a kind of adventure. This makes for great gifts during the holidays and stuff too. So you might have a bumper crop of tomatoes and you might not be able to eat them all, but making some homemade taco sauce could be a good gift for the holidays. And with that, here's my contact information. As always, reach out at any time with any questions. And we will be having a food preservation class this summer. If you want to learn how to can tomatoes safely, if you've never done it before, that information is on our website right now that you can sign up for. And let's see, we have some questions. So why remove skins and seeds? When you are doing canning products, sometimes the skins and seeds just can develop an off flavor over time, especially if they're left in a canning product. If we think about it, our canned goods can stay on the shelf for 6 months up to a year, if or longer. And so we just recommend taking them out to kind of prevent that from getting that off flavor. If you are making a kind of ready to eat or fresh sauce or salsa, you could certainly leave the tomato skins on if it's not going to be a canned product. Some people tend to think that the seeds upset their stomach, or especially if you have diverticulitis, then the seeds, you're supposed to avoid some of those seeds. So just taking it out tends to be the safest route, and also texture wise and flavor wise. However, sometimes I'm too lazy to get all of my seeds out. And so a few seeds don't hurt, but definitely you wouldn't want to keep all of the seeds in when you're canning. And then after boiling, yes, put your products, put your tomatoes in an ice bath to help the skins peel off super easy. There have been some other recommendations that I've seen about, putting your skins, scoring your tomatoes and putting them under the broiler, and that can help to get the skins off super easy. But most common is probably the boil, put it in an ice bath, and then that basically what happens is think of the ice bath as being a cauterization for the skin cells, and it kind of seals up those skin cells, which allows then that skin to peel off super easy from the flesh of the tomato.
Chelsea, I may jump in here for a second. We did get a question about whether K-State will be selling tomatoes this year, and I wasn't quite sure of the direction of that. But either way, I've just found out actually, yes, we will be selling both plants and fruits. So the Master Gardeners will have their sales going on. One will be at the Overland Park Arboretum that I'm aware of, and they will have vegetables available. I'm assuming tomatoes will be amongst those. And then we also have our pop-up markets that we hold at the Sunset Community Garden at 11875 South Sunset Drive in Olathe. And those are in June, July, and August. Specifically, the July and August are the ones that I would be looking for the tomato crops to be for sale. Okay, do we have any more questions? Well, we thank you both so much, or thank you all so much for your time today. Stay tuned for next month. We are going to be talking about blueberries. Very interesting crop to try to grow in Kansas, let me tell you. So, and it'll be a fun one. Thank you so much. We'll